everyone, welcome back. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into something that's been all over the news lately.
Oh, yeah.
Tensions are rising in the South China Sea, and not in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
We keep hearing about these, what are they calling them? Unsafe and unprofessional intercepts
Right.
by Chinese fighter jets, and they're targeting U.S. and allied aircraft.
Yeah, it's a bit concerning.
So we've got a ton of stuff to go through today. Defense reports, from Australia and the U.S.
I've seen those, yeah.
Statements directly from China, trying to figure out their side of the story.
Always important.
And to help us make sense of all this, we've got some expert analysis from retired U.S. Air Force Brigadier General Houston Cantwell.
He's got a lot of insight, that's for sure.
So basically, we're going to try to answer a few key questions today. What exactly are these risky tactics that everyone's talking about?
Yeah, what are they actually doing?
Right, exactly. And then why? Why is China doing this?
The big question.
And finally, and this is the part that keeps me up at night, what could happen? What are the potential consequences of all of this?
Yeah, nobody wants to see things escalate.
No, definitely not. So with that in mind, let's dive right in.
Sounds good.
One of the most recent incidents that really caught everyone's attention involved an Australian P-8A Poseidon aircraft. You know those planes?
Surveillance, right.
Exactly. Maritime patrol and reconnaissance. So imagine this. You're on a routine patrol over the South China Sea. Everything's normal.
Yep, just another day at the office.
Right. And all of a sudden, bam, a Chinese J-16 fighter jet shows up.
Out of nowhere.
Practically, yeah. And this J-16 gets dangerously close to the Australian plane and pops flares.
Flares? Like the bright ones.
Yeah, those things. And let me tell you, that's not just some harmless little show.
I was going to say, seems kind of dangerous.
It's extremely dangerous. Those flares, they can actually burn an aircraft or get sucked into the engine.
Oh, wow. Didn't think about that.
And if that happens, it's game over. Catastrophic engine failure.
So it's not just like a warning or something.
It's a serious risk. And what's even more worrying is that this isn't an isolated incident.
Oh, I know it.
There have been similar incidents involving the Philippines and Australia.
Like how similar?
Very similar. In 2022, there was one where a Chinese J-16 released chaff near an Australian P-8.
Chaff? What's that?
It's basically these tiny pieces of metal, like a cloud of them, designed to confuse radar system.
Oh, like a countermeasure.
Exactly. And guess what? Some of that chaff ended up getting sucked into the P-8's engine.
Yikes.
Not good. So we had General Cantwell take a look at all this, and he basically said there are two main dangers with these tactics.
Makes sense.
First, all these aggressive maneuvers, they significantly increase the risk of a mid-air collision. I mean, these guys are flying crazy close to each other.
Yeah, one wrong move.
Exactly. And second, as we've already talked about, the flares, they could seriously damage an aircraft.
So it's a combination of, like, reckless flying and potentially using weapons.
It's a recipe for disaster. And it's not just General Cantwell saying this. The U.S. Department of Defense has been tracking all of this, and they've got some pretty alarming statistics.
Oh, no. Give me the numbers.
So since the fall of 2021, get this, there have been over 180 of these risky intercepts by Chinese military aircraft.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. And to put that in perspective, that's more in 2 years than in the entire decade before that.
Whoa, that's a big jump.
Huge jump. And it's not just U.S. aircraft being targeted either. Allied and partnered nations have reported around 100 similar incidents.
So it's like a pattern of behavior?
Yeah, a pretty clear pattern. Now, of course, we have to consider what China's saying about all of this.
Why, what's their side of the story?
Well, unsurprisingly, they're defending their actions. They're saying everything they're doing is perfectly legitimate, lawful, and professional.
Okay.
Their foreign ministry spokesperson even went so far as to say that Australia needs to stop infringing on Chinese sovereignty in the South China Sea.
So they're basically saying it's their backyard and they can do what they want.
That's pretty much it, yeah. So the big question is why? Why is China taking all these risks? What's their motivation here?
Good question. Lots of possibilities.
Right. So some experts think it's basically a show of force. They're saying, hey, look at us. We've got a powerful military now, and we're not afraid to use it.
Like they're flexing their muscles.
Exactly. Others are saying it's more strategic. They think China's trying to challenge the U.S. and its allies in this region, which is super important strategically.
The South China Sea is a pretty big deal.
Huge deal. So it could be a combination of factors, a display of power, a strategic challenge, maybe even just testing the boundaries to see what they can get away with.
Yeah, it's a dangerous game they're playing.
Absolutely. And especially when we consider the history here, it gets even more worrisome.
Oh, yeah, there's been some trouble in the past, right?
Right. We've seen collisions involving Chinese and Russian intercept aircraft before, and those incidents really highlight just how dangerous this kind of behavior can be.
Like with real consequences.
Real consequences, yeah. I mean, just look at the 2001 Hainan Island incident. A U.S. EP-3 spy plane collided with a Chinese fighter jet. The American plane had to make an emergency landing on Hainan Island.
Wow, I vaguely remember that.
Yeah, it was a big deal. The Chinese pilot, sadly, lost his life, and the U.S. crew was detained for over a week. It caused a major international crisis.
Tensions were sky high.
Definitely. And then more recently, in 2023, a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone was brought down after a Russian jet clipped it over the Black Sea.
That was just last year, wasn't it?
Yeah, pretty recent, and that incident just shows how easily things can spiral out of control. It's like they're playing a high-stakes game of chicken, pushing things further and further.
And nobody wins in that scenario.
Exactly. So we're left with this really unsettling question. What is China's ultimate goal here? Are they deliberately trying to provoke a conflict?
Or are they just miscalculating the risks?
It's a terrifying thought either way.
No kidding.
And when you consider the already volatile environment of the South China Sea, it gets even scarier.
Yeah, that place is like a powder keg.
It really is, and China's actions are just adding fuel to the fire.
So the big question is, what can be done? How do we prevent these risky intercepts from turning into something much, much worse?
What are your thoughts on that? I mean, you've analyzed similar situations before. What can we learn from those?
You know, it's interesting when you think about it. We've seen this kind of behavior before.
What do you mean?
Well, both China and Russia have a bit of a history of using these risky intercept tactics.
Oh, that's right. You mentioned earlier there have been some pretty serious incidents involving their aircraft.
Yeah, and those incidents really drive home the point that this is not a game.
No, definitely not. Their stakes are incredibly high.
Exactly. Like take the 2001 Hainan Island incident, for example.
Oh, yeah, that was a bad one.
A U.S. EP-3 spy plane collides with a Chinese fighter jet, forcing it to make an emergency landing on Hainan Island.
And the Chinese pilot lost his life?
Tragically, yes. And the American crew was detained for over a week.
Sparked a major international crisis.
Absolutely. And then there was that incident with the U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone just last year.
Oh, yeah, the one that was brought down after a Russian jet clipped it over the Black Sea.
Exactly. It's like they're constantly pushing the limits, seeing how far they can go without triggering a major conflict.
It's a dangerous game to play, wouldn't you say?
Without a doubt. So it begs the question, what is China's ultimate goal here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Are they trying to provoke a conflict, or are they just miscalculating?
Well, there are a few possible explanations. Some experts believe it's a way for China to show off their growing military strength and confidence.
Sort of like a, hey, look at us, we're powerful now kind of thing.
Exactly. Like they're trying to send a message that they're a force to be reckoned with.
But couldn't that backfire and actually provoke the very conflict they're trying to avoid?
It's a gamble, for sure. And that's why understanding their motivations is so crucial. Are they being intentionally provocative? Or are they simply misjudging the potential consequences of their actions?
It's a pretty scary thought, especially when you consider the already volatile environment of the South China Sea.
Yeah, you tell them it's like adding gasoline to a fire.
So what can be done to de-escalate the situation? How do we even begin to address such a complex problem?
Honestly, there's no easy answer. It's going to require a multifaceted approach, one that addresses both the immediate concerns, like the dangerous intercepts, and the underlying drivers of the conflict, such as the territorial disputes.
That sounds incredibly complicated. Can you break down what that approach might look like?
Well, first and foremost, we need to keep the lines of communication open. That means regular dialogue between military and diplomatic officials from all the countries involved.
So basically trying to build trust and prevent misunderstandings that could lead to unintended escalation.
Exactly. But it's equally important to address the root causes of the conflict, the territorial disputes.
Right. Those aren't going to just magically disappear overnight.
Unfortunately not. It's a daunting task trying to get two sides that are so deeply entrenched in their positions to even come to the table, let alone find some common ground.
So how do we do it?
It requires patience, a genuine commitment to finding solutions that benefit everyone, and perhaps most importantly, a willingness to compromise.
So it's about finding a balance between competing interests, reducing tensions, and ultimately creating a more stable and secure environment for everyone involved.
Precisely. It's a long and difficult road, but it's the only path that leads to a sustainable peace.
Well, this has been pretty intense. We've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah, we have. We've talked about the dangerous tactics, the possible motivations behind China's actions, the historical context, and the complexities of the South China Sea.
And we've started to explore some potential solutions.
And the dire consequences of inaction.
We've barely scratched the surface, though. There's still so much more to unpack. What are your thoughts on where we go from here?
Yeah, you're right. We've only just begun to sort of unravel this whole thing.
Okay, so in this final part, let's try to tackle some of those really tough questions, like what can the international community actually do to de-escalate the situation?
Right.
And what happens if we just, sit back and do nothing?
Yeah, that's the scary part.
And maybe even more broadly, what can we learn from all of this to prevent these kinds of things from happening again in the future?
Big picture stuff.
Exactly. So you mentioned earlier the importance of diplomacy and communication.
Yeah.
What, concrete steps could be taken to reduce these tensions? How do we actually prevent these risky intercepts from turning into a full-blown conflict?
Well, one thing that could really help is establishing clear lines of communication.
Between who?
Between military and diplomatic officials from all the countries involved. So if a situation starts to get out of hand, they can quickly talk to each other and hopefully de-escalate things.
Oh, so it's like having a direct line, a hotline almost.
Exactly. It's all about making sure everyone's intentions are clear, preventing misunderstandings that could lead to, someone accidentally pushing the wrong button.
Right, right. So more communication, more transparency, that kind of thing. Do you think things like, regular consultations or joint exercises could help those confidence-building measures we hear about sometimes?
Absolutely. Those types of initiatives can definitely help to build trust and reduce tensions. But let's not forget about the elephant in the room.
Which is?
The territorial disputes. Those are at the heart of the problem in the South China Sea.
Yeah, and they're not going away anytime soon.
Not without some serious effort. So the question is, how do we address those?
Okay, so how do we address those? What options are on the table?
Well, one option is joint development of resources. What if, instead of fighting over who owns what, countries set aside their claims for now and work together to, develop the resources in the South China Sea?
You mean like sharing the pie, so to speak?
Exactly. We could be talking about joint fishing agreements, oil and gas exploration, even tourism ventures. Imagine that, countries cooperating for mutual benefit.
It's a nice thought, but is it realistic? These countries have been at odds for so long.
It's definitely challenging, but it's not impossible. There have been successful examples of joint development agreements in other parts of the world. It takes political will, compromise, and some creative thinking, but the potential rewards are huge.
Less conflict, more economic benefits, everyone wins.
That's the idea. Now, another option is to go for some kind of negotiated settlement. Sit down, hash things out, try to come up with a solution that everyone can live with.
So actual negotiations, treaties, that kind of thing.
Exactly. This could involve defining maritime boundaries, establishing exclusive economic zones, maybe even creating a joint management regime for disputed areas. It's a long and complicated process, though.
Yeah, those things can take years, decades even.
And in the meantime, the risk of escalation remains. That's why those confidence-building measures are so important. It's about taking small steps to reduce tensions while those bigger, more complex issues are being worked out.
Okay, so give me some examples. What do those confidence-building measures actually look like in practice?
Well, you could set up hotlines between military commands. That way, if there's an incident, they can communicate directly and prevent things from spiraling out of control.
Direct line of gun makes sense.
Right. Another idea is joint search and rescue exercises. That shows a willingness to cooperate, even between countries that don't always see eye to eye. Sharing information about military activities can also help to build trust. And then there are things like people-to-people exchanges, cultural programs, student visas.
So building relationships, not just between governments, but between people.
Exactly. The more we understand each other, the less likely we are to, jump to conclusions and assume the worst.
Okay, those are all good ideas, but let's play devil's advocate for a second. What happens if all of this fails? What if none of these efforts work? What are we looking at then?
Well, in that case, things could get really bad really fast. Continued escalation, increased militarization, a heightened risk of conflict, it's all on the table. And the stakes are incredibly high. We have to remember that.
In what way?
The South China Sea is one of the most important shipping lanes in the world. A conflict there would be devastating for global trade and security. It's not just about China and the U.S. The whole world would feel the impact.
So the consequences of inaction are potentially global.
Absolutely. This isn't something we can just ignore and hope it goes away. We need to be proactive. We need to engage. We need to find a way forward.
Okay, so I think it's time to wrap things up here. We've covered a lot in this deep dive. We've talked about the dangerous tactics being used, the complex reasons behind China's actions, the potential consequences of doing nothing, and some possible paths towards a peaceful solution.
Phew, yeah, it's been a lot.
As we end this episode, we want to leave you with something to think about. Given the, delicate situation and the high stakes involved, what role should the international community play in preventing these risky intercepts from escalating into a major conflict?
It's a tough question, but one that we all need to be asking ourselves. The future of the South China Sea, and maybe even the world, could depend on it.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we hope you'll join us again next time for another fascinating topic.